The studio lights were a blinding, clinical white, ringed by blue halos that made my eyes ache. Across from me, the host straightened his tie, waiting for the floor director to point a finger. The red light on camera 3 blinked awake. The teleprompter scrolled its bright green text, and the host read it with practiced enthusiasm. He announced that Callaway Systems had just completed a $25 billion initial public offering. He looked right at me, his smile perfectly calibrated for morning television, and said the founder, Ren Callaway, was now set to acquire Ashford Logistics Group. He leaned forward, lowering his voice to simulate intimacy. He asked how it felt to take over the company that fired me 5 years ago. I looked straight into the camera lens. I did not smile. My right hand gripped the armrest of the chair, and the thumb and index finger of my left hand slowly spun my spare reading glasses. The studio was completely silent. 3 seconds passed. In television time, 3 seconds is an eternity, a void that makes producers hold their breath in panic. I let the silence stretch because I wanted the weight of the answer to settle before I even spoke the words. I was 38 years old, and I was exhausted. The victory did not feel like a parade. It felt like standing in the rubble of a city you had to burn down just to prove you owned the bricks. It feels like coming home to a house I built with my own hands, I said, my voice quiet and steady. A house where someone else put their name on the mailbox. 5 Christmases before that interview, my mother-in-law poured me half a glass of wine. Everyone else at the long oak dining table got a full pour. I watched the dark red Merlot stop exactly halfway up the crystal bowl, and I said nothing. The heavy scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon candles mixed with the sharp, expensive bite of Joy by Dior. Cordelia Ashford wore that perfume like armor. She sat at the head of the table in a tailored navy suit, her platinum hair brushed back. Holding court over her empire, Marshall sat to my right. My husband kept his eyes on his plate, his hands gripping his linen napkin under the table so tightly his knuckles were white. Across from me sat his younger sister, Greer, the vice president of human resources for Ashford Logistics Group. Uncle Stu and Aunt Pam flanked the other end, nodding along to whatever Cordelia was saying. Cordelia was talking about the firm. She was always talking about the firm. We landed the regional contract for Costco, Cordelia announced, cutting into her meat. The silver knife scraped against the porcelain plate, a sharp, whining sound that made my teeth grind. 22 trucks, 14 routes across the eastern seaboard. She paused, lifting her chin to look down the table at me. The air in the room seemed to go perfectly still. Ren, you should understand routes, Cordelia said. Her tone was conversational, coated in a thick layer of Delaware polite that barely hid the condescension beneath it. You are in, what is it? Algorithms? Supply chain optimization, I said. I kept my voice flat, giving her absolutely nothing to work with. Any enthusiasm would be weaponized. Any defense would be an invitation for slaughter. Right. Optimization. Cordelia set her knife down. She offered me a smile, the kind of smile you give a child who just handed you a drawing made of mud. Marshall tells me you have been working on something after hours, a little side project on your laptop. It is a logistics platform, I replied, taking a small sip of my half glass of wine. Artificial intelligence-driven dispatch routing. Artificial intelligence. Cordelia looked around the table, ensuring everyone was watching. Uncle Stu chuckled into his water glass. Sweetheart, we move boxes here. Real boxes, on real trucks, across real highways. Your little startup dreams? She picked up her wine glass, holding it by the stem. Pixie dust. Uncle Stu laughed louder this time. Greer stared fiercely at her cranberry sauce. Marshall did not move. He did not speak. The silence from the man sitting next to me was louder than the laughter. I grew up in Scranton, raised by a grandmother who taught me how to fix the dishwasher when I was 9 because no one was coming to fix it for us. I went to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology on a full scholarship. I spent my entire life sitting at tables where I felt like the charity case, the scholarship kid waiting for someone to ask to see my invitation. Cordelia knew exactly where to slide the knife. After dinner, I walked toward the kitchen to carry plates. I stopped in the hallway, pressing my back against the cold wallpaper. The sound of water running in the sink masked my footsteps. But it did not mask their voices. "She is embarrassing the family," Marshall, Cordelia was saying. "Playing tech entrepreneur while we are running a real business. Mom, her algorithm actually works," Marshall said. His voice was weak, lacking any real conviction. "I built this company with my own hands," Cordelia snapped, shutting off the water. "With Ashford hands. She is a Callaway. She will always be a Callaway." I closed my eyes. I counted to 3, a habit my grandmother taught me to keep the anger from boiling over. Then I turned around and walked out the front door into the freezing December night. 2 weeks later, an email arrived in my inbox with the subject line regarding organizational restructuring. The Human Resources office on the 3rd floor of the Ashford Logistics building smelled like stale coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. Greer sat across from me. She did not look into my eyes. She looked at my left ear. A corporate trick. Cordelia taught her executives to simulate eye contact without having to endure the human connection. A script was glowing on her open laptop screen, the text reflecting perfectly backward in the glass partition behind her head. "Wren, the company is moving in a new direction," Greer recited, her voice a monotone drone. "Your role in the data analytics team is being consolidated." She slid a manila folder across the polished wood table. The severance package was standard: 3 months of salary and continued health coverage. I opened the folder and read every line, searching for the non-compete clause. There was none. I thought back to the employment agreement I signed 4 years ago. It stated that work product created during work hours using company resources belonged to the firm. My dispatch routing algorithm was written between 11 at night and 3 in the morning. I wrote it on my personal laptop, sitting at my kitchen table, pulling public Department of Transportation data. I had not violated a single term. I signed the severance paper and slid it back. Greer let out a long breath, clearly relieved that I had not caused a scene. She reached under her desk and brought up a small cardboard box. "Your personal items," she said. I looked inside. A dead, miniature cactus, 2 spiral notebooks, a spare pair of reading glasses, and a small wooden picture frame. It was a photograph of Marshall and me, standing outside this very building on my first day of work. Marshall was beaming. I was smiling too, but looking at it now, I recognized the tight, anxious expression of someone hoping they finally belonged somewhere. I carried the box through the second-floor operations pit. 30 people were typing at their desks. Not a single person looked up. They had been instructed to keep their heads down. I walked out the glass double doors and into the bitter January wind cutting off the Christina River. I set the box on the passenger seat of my car and gripped the freezing steering wheel. I did not cry. Crying was a waste of processing power. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. Marshall's name lit up the screen. "I did not know Greer was going to handle it," Marshall said the moment I answered. "Yes, you did," I replied, my voice devoid of any inflection. A heavy, suffocating silence stretched across the line. "Keep the picture frame," Marshall finally whispered. "Please." "Why?" "Because you were here, Wren," he said, his voice breaking. "Do not let Mom erase that." It was an odd thing to say, an odd detail to focus on when my career had just been eliminated. I looked at the wooden frame resting against the dead cactus in the box. I did not know then that Marshall had carefully pried open the back of that frame. I did not know that slipped neatly behind the thick cardboard backing, entirely invisible from the outside, was a small black flash drive containing enough evidence to destroy his mother's empire. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, put the car in drive, and left the parking lot. 2 months passed. March brought a muddy, gray spring to Wilmington. I was sitting at my kitchen table, nursing a cold cup of coffee, running through my pitch deck for angel investors. I needed seed funding to launch Callaway Systems. I opened an internet browser to search the federal patent database, doing standard due diligence to check the competitive landscape in the logistics sector. I typed my keywords into the search bar: supply chain, artificial intelligence optimization, dispatch routing. The search engine returned the results. I scrolled past the first two. My eyes locked onto the third link. The assignee was Ashford Logistics Group. The filing date was October. 2 full months before the Christmas dinner. 2 months before Cordelia Ashford sat at the head of the table and called my work pixie dust. My breath caught in my throat. I clicked the link and opened the full application document. I read the abstract. I read the technical claims. The blood drained from my face, leaving my skin cold and clammy. It was my algorithm. It was not just similar. It was identical. It used the exact same architecture I had spent 18 months building. It used my specific variable naming conventions, the prefix letters I had used since my graduate school days. It included the exact same edge case handling for rural delivery routes that had taken me 3 sleepless weeks to solve. Under the section for the named inventor, there was no name. It simply read Internal Research and Development Team. I picked up my phone and dialed Marshall. He answered on the second ring. "Marshall," I said, my voice echoing off the empty walls of my apartment. "Did your mother patent my algorithm?" I heard him inhale sharply. "What do you mean?" "The federal patent application," I said, reading the screen. "Filed in October. It is my code, my architecture, my exact variable names." "Marshall, did she take it from the demonstration file I showed her last fall?" He did not answer the question. The silence was an admission of guilt, thick and suffocating. "Wren," he pleaded, his voice thin and desperate. "Please, do not do anything right now. Please." I ended the call and placed the phone face down on the table. "Do not do anything right now." That was the command of a man who knew exactly what had been done. I looked at the filing date again. October. The humiliation at the Christmas dinner, the comments about pixie dust, the swift termination in January. None of it was a spontaneous reaction to an embarrassing daughter-in-law. It was a carefully choreographed performance. Cordelia had already decided to steal my life's work, and the dinner was simply a smokescreen to convince the rest of the family that I was nothing more than a delusional dreamer. She wanted me to walk away without ever looking back. I closed my laptop. I stared at the dark aluminum cover for a long moment. Then I reached for my notebook, picked up a pen, and wrote down a single name: Nadia Park. An intellectual property lawyer my old professor had mentioned years ago. I did not have the money to fight a $400 million company. I did not have the power, but I had the time-stamped code on my hard drive, and I finally understood the rules of the game Cordelia Ashford was playing. She thought I was just going to disappear. She was wrong. The elevator carrying me up to the 7th floor of Park & Associates groaned like a dying animal, shuddering against the cables. I stepped out into a narrow hallway lit by flickering fluorescent bulbs that buzzed with a constant, irritating hum. Nadia Park did not waste her money on a view. Her office in downtown Philadelphia was cramped and completely practical, the walls lined with heavy legal volumes stacked all the way to the ceiling. I sat across from her massive wooden desk and laid out my entire life. I set down my personal laptop, an external hard drive, and a printed copy of the federal patent application. Nadia wore a severe black suit. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and she wore absolutely no jewelry. She poured water from a filtered pitcher into a heavy glass, set it on a leather coaster, and began to read. I watched the second hand on her wall clock sweep around the dial. The dry air in the office smelled like old paper and printer ink. 8 minutes passed in complete silence. The buzzing light fixture out in the hallway felt incredibly loud. My jaw ached from clenching my teeth. "Your employment agreement specifically says work hours and company resources," Nadia finally said. She tapped the printed contract with a manicured finger. "You built this routing platform at home, on your own machine, using public transit data. Every single line," I replied. "I can show you the entire commit history on my local drive." "Good." Nadia closed the manila folder and folded her hands over it. Patent inventorship correction is a federal matter under Title 35 of the United States Code. We can also go to the Delaware Chancery Court for breach of fiduciary duty, and we can pursue trade secret misappropriation under state law. She paused, picking up her glass of water. She took a slow sip, measuring her next words. "But Wren, Ashford Logistics is a $400 million company. Cordelia Ashford has litigated before, and she keeps a massive legal war chest. This process will take years, and it will cost hundreds of thousands of dollars." "I do not have hundreds of thousands of dollars," I told her. My fingers gripped the wooden arms of the guest chair so tightly, my knuckles turned white. Nadia looked at me. For the first time since I walked into her office, her expression shifted. It was not pity. It was recognition. Sharp and deeply personal. "My mother designed custom furniture for her employer for 9 straight years, the attorney said. Her voice dropped a fraction of an octave, losing its clinical edge. "They patented everything she ever drew. She did not know she had the right to fight them. She died thinking those beautiful designs were not hers." The buzzing light in the hall seemed to fade. The silence in the small room felt dense and heavy. "I will take this case on a modified contingency," Nadia said, leaning forward. "If we win, I get 15% of the total damages. If we lose, you owe me nothing. But Wren, we need more than your computer timestamps. We need to prove this is a pattern of behavior." I walked out of that brick building feeling the biting Philadelphia wind against my face. My stomach still felt hollow and tight, and I was still unemployed. But for the first time in 3 months, I was no longer standing in the dark alone. That night, sleep simply refused to come. I paced the hardwood floor of my apartment, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator. Around 2 in the morning, I pulled a dusty cardboard box from the top shelf of my hall closet. Inside sat my orientation name tag from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. My name was printed on a white slip of paper, held together by a cheap plastic clip. I traced the faded ink with my thumb. I remembered my very first day on that campus. Everyone asked where I was from, and when I said Scranton, nobody asked a second question. The wealthy kids from Westchester and Orange County had recognized an outsider immediately. I sat on the edge of my bed and rubbed my burning eyes. If I sued Cordelia right now, I would be the scholarship kid sitting at the rich table all over again. The corporate lawyers for Ashford Logistics would label me a disgruntled former employee looking for a payout. The business reporters would write headlines about a bitter daughter-in-law making wild, unfounded claims. Cordelia would only need to ask the press one question. If her algorithm is truly brilliant, why has she done nothing with it in 4 years? I walked back to my kitchen table and opened my laptop. The code was still there. 18 months of history, logging every late night and every early morning. Thousands of lines written while the rest of the world slept. This was not just a legal claim. This was physical proof of my own mind, and I believed in evidence far more than I believed in a crafted narrative. I watched the sky outside my window turn from black to a bruised purple, and then to a pale, cold blue. I picked up my phone and dialed Nadia at exactly 6 in the morning. She answered on the first ring. Do not file the lawsuit yet, I told her. The tight knot in my chest had finally dissolved, replaced by a cold, clear focus. I am going to build my company first. When Callaway Systems is actually worth something, we will have real leverage. We will not just be a complaint on a piece of paper. Smart, Nadia said, her voice rough with sleep. Build the moat before you storm the castle. The next week, I rented a desk at a shared workspace in downtown Wilmington for $200 a month. My corner sat right next to a drafty window that let in the chill of the river. The nearest electrical outlet was 10 feet away, forcing me to buy a bright orange extension cord just to keep my machine running. My entire corporate infrastructure consisted of my personal laptop, a reusable water bottle, and a secondary monitor I bought secondhand off the internet for $85. The monitor had a deep scratch in the bottom left corner. But the pixels worked. I made a crucial, strategic decision. That very first morning, I refused to touch the original demonstration file I had shown Cordelia. Instead, I started entirely from scratch. I built a completely new architecture around the core mathematical logic. I optimized the data pathways, reduced the processing load, and added predictive features the original version never possessed. If Cordelia ever tried to claim in a courtroom that I was copying from the Ashford patent, I could easily prove my new system vastly exceeded the scope of her stolen document. The patent only covered my basic prototype. I was building a monster. By April, the initial product was ready. I ran a test using a public database of trucking routes across the eastern seaboard. The new Callaway Systems platform performed 23% better than the current version Ashford Logistics was using in the field. I knew their exact performance metrics because I had built the original system they currently deployed. In May, I started pitching to angel investors. I sat through 11 different meetings in generic office parks and loud coffee shops. I received 11 polite, firm rejections. Nobody wanted to fund a solo female founder with zero revenue operating in the incredibly boring logistics industry. Every single night, I walked back to my cheap desk, updated my presentation deck based on their dismissive feedback, and kept writing code. June brought the suffocating summer humidity to Delaware, and it also brought my 12th meeting. Bob Trammell was 61 years old. He was a retired executive from Federal Express who had seen every trick and failure in the freight industry. We met at a crowded networking event in a downtown hotel lobby. The air conditioning was failing, and the room smelled like damp suits and stale pastries. Show me the algorithm beating the current market leader on a real dataset, Bob demanded. He crossed his arms over his chest, his eyes sharp and unblinking. I opened my laptop right there on a high cocktail table. I ran a live demonstration, feeding the system 340 active delivery routes across the coast. Callaway Systems optimized the entire grid in 4.2 seconds. The public benchmark for the Ashford system was 11.7 seconds. Bob stared at the glowing screen for a long time. The chatter of the networking event faded into white noise. He reached into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out a leather checkbook. I am writing you a check for $250,000, Bob said, clicking his silver pen. I do not invest in pixie dust. He winked at me. I stared blankly back at him, completely failing to understand the joke at that moment. I had not told a single soul about the Christmas dinner. I learned later that Bob had attended a major industry conference where Cordelia Ashford gave a keynote speech. She had publicly declared that artificial intelligence was pixie dust for people who had never actually loaded a truck. That arrogant dismissal was her entire reputation among the old guard. I have one condition, the retired executive continued. He tore the check from the pad and slid it across the table. You file for your own patent within 60 days. Protect your intellectual property. I already have the provisional application drafted, I told him, keeping my hands steady as I picked up the slip of paper. Good. One more thing. If the Ashford family ever comes after you, I know a forensic intellectual property consultant. His name is Theo Voss. He used to work at the patent office, and he is extremely thorough. I filed the provisional patent application for the new Callaway Systems architecture 4 days later. I submitted the heavy stack of paperwork before I even deposited Bob Trammell's money into the bank. I was following Nadia Park's strict legal advice to protect the new version immediately, keeping it entirely separate from the upcoming battle over the stolen prototype. I now had seed funding, a registered provisional patent, legal counsel working on contingency, and a brilliant industry advisor. I was not striking back yet. I was digging my trenches. A week later, Marshall came to my apartment for the first time in 3 months. We were separated in every practical sense, but neither of us had spoken the words aloud. He brought a container of truffle mushroom pasta from an expensive Italian place downtown. The small apartment filled with the rich scent of roasted garlic and heavy cream. We sat at the kitchen table, the silence stretching between us like a physical wall. He kept the radio playing softly in the background, a barrier against conversation. Neither of us mentioned Cordelia. Neither of us mentioned the patent filing. Marshall watched me type a line of code on my laptop. He picked at his food. His shoulders slumped, looking like a man carrying a weight he refused to acknowledge. "You look different," my husband said quietly. He did not look at my face. He looked at my hands, resting on the keyboard. I did not stop typing. I did not look up from the bright screen. "I am different," I replied. By the 3rd quarter of that first year, I moved out of the shared workspace and signed a lease for a ground-floor unit in a brick building in Trolley Square. I carried my own keys in my coat pocket. They were heavy brass, and every time I unlocked the deadbolt in the morning, the metallic click echoed through the empty hallway like a gunshot. The air inside our new office smelled faintly of damp masonry, industrial bleach, and the cheap roasted coffee we brewed by the gallon. But the locks were mine. I hired 2 engineers using the seed money Bob Trammell provided. Val Odom was 26 years old and built back-end databases like a bricklayer laying a permanent foundation. Reggie Kidd was 31 and handled the complex data science models. We assembled 3 cheap wooden desks we bought in flat boxes and mounted a massive whiteboard we hauled back from a bulk warehouse store. That autumn, Callaway Systems landed its very first paying customer. They were a regional freight carrier, operating 40 massive trucks up and down the asphalt corridor, stretching across Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. We optimized their delivery routes. We saved them thousands of gallons in diesel fuel and eliminated countless hours of driver overtime. We closed our first 12 months with $380,000 in booked revenue. It was not enough to turn a profit, but it was absolute proof of concept. The platform worked in the real world. I kept my name entirely off our marketing materials. The basic website we built listed the company leadership simply as the founding team, and there were no photographs of my face anywhere on the internet. I was not ready for Cordelia Ashford to know what I was building. Callaway Systems was not strong enough yet to survive a direct assault from her legal department. Late one Friday evening, I stood by the door holding a cold cup of coffee, watching Val and Reggie debate a routing logic problem at the whiteboard. Val had blue ink smeared across her left hand. Reggie was pointing at a dense cluster of variables. The wall heater hummed steadily against the exposed brick. For my entire life, I had waited for someone to invite me to sit at their table. Standing in that cramped, drafty office, I realized I did not need an invitation anymore. I had built the room myself. 2 weeks into October, I drove across town to Marshall's apartment. We were living completely separate lives by then, but we maintained a fragile routine of eating dinner together twice a week. There was an unspoken rule hovering in the air between us. We never talked about his mother, and we never talked about the logistics firm. I sat on a wooden stool at his kitchen island while he cooked. The warm yellow light from the pendant lamps cast long shadows across the granite counter. A soft jazz trumpet played from a small wireless speaker resting next to the spice rack. Marshall always put music on when he cooked because the noise filled the empty space where conversation was supposed to be. The kitchen smelled incredible, thick with the rich scent of onions caramelizing slowly in hot butter and crushed garlic. It was domestic. It was comfortable. It was a complete lie. Marshall stood at the cutting board, meticulously slicing another yellow onion. His movements were careful, even, and endlessly patient. He approached every single task in his life with that exact same caution. "Mom asked about you today," Marshall said. He did not look up from his hands. I kept my fingers wrapped tightly around my glass of ice water. "She never asks about me. She said to ask if Ren is still playing with computers," he murmured. The jazz trumpet slid through a long, mournful note. The heavy chef knife tapped rhythmically against the wooden board. I watched the steel blade rise and fall, cutting the pale vegetable into tiny, uniform squares. He was methodical. He never rushed. "What did you say to her?" I asked. "I said you are doing well. Doing well." It was the ultimate diplomatic nothing. It was not telling his mother that I had started a company, and it was certainly not telling her that I had secured actual paying clients. It was a blank wall built to avoid any possible conflict. I looked at Marshall's left hand holding the onion steady. His gold wedding band caught the warm light and threw a tiny reflection across the granite. I glanced down at my own left hand resting on the cold stone counter. My ring was still there too, a heavy circle of metal that suddenly felt like a chain. I loved the man standing in front of me, but I realized I was starting to love him from a great distance. It felt exactly like loving a photograph of someone you used to know. A question burned in the back of my throat. I desperately wanted to ask him if Cordelia had stolen my algorithm and filed the federal paperwork before she fired me. The words were right there, pressing fiercely against my teeth, but I swallowed them down with a sip of freezing water. I knew exactly what he would do if I asked. He would claim he did not know, or he would beg me not to start a war. I would be forced to make an impossible choice right there in his kitchen. I would have to decide whether to trust him completely or suspect him entirely. I was simply not ready for either option. Marshall scraped the diced onions into the hot skillet. The butter hissed and popped. He kept his back to me, staring down at the stove. He did not turn around to look at my face. Trapped between his absolute loyalty to the woman who raised him and the vows he made to me, he chose the safest possible route. He chose to do nothing at all. I found out later exactly how Cordelia discovered I had not disappeared into failure. In March of my second year in business, a prominent industry magazine called Logistics Today published their annual forecast issue. They ran a feature article titled 10 Startups Disrupting Freight in 2026. Callaway Systems was ranked 7th on the list. The editors included a small, black and white photograph of my face next to my title as founder and chief executive officer. I was captured in profile, wearing my thick black reading glasses, looking away from the camera toward something just outside the frame. Greer walked into her mother's massive corner office on the executive floor of the Ashford Logistics Group building. The room was a monument to Cordelia, filled with dark mahogany panels, leather chairs, and a sweeping view of the Wilmington port facilities. Greer carried the glossy magazine in her hand. She placed it squarely in the center of the oak desk, open to the exact page featuring my face. She did not say a single word. The vice president of human resources simply turned around and walked back out, letting the paper do the talking. Cordelia picked up the magazine. The heavy pages rustled in the quiet room. The founder of Ashford Logistics stared at my photograph, her eyes scanning the short paragraph detailing my first year of operations. The reported revenue of $380,000 would not have impressed her in the slightest. It was a rounding error for her accounting department. But then her eyes moved to the technology description. The journalist had written about an artificial intelligence-driven dispatch routing system, leveraging proprietary supply chain optimization. It was the exact terminology I had used at her Christmas dinner. It was the exact approach she had filed under her own corporate name. I could imagine her perfectly manicured fingers tightening on the glossy paper. The gold signet ring she wore on her right hand pressing hard into the page. In her mind, the algorithm did not belong to me. It belonged to the environment she had provided. I had dared to take the intellectual property she believed was rightfully hers, and worse, I was receiving public credit for it. Cordelia set the magazine down, picked up her desk phone, and demanded her assistant connect her immediately to Morris Fenton. He was the senior corporate counsel for the firm. The silent war was officially over. Cordelia knew I was building a castle, and she was preparing to burn it to the ground. The summer heat in Delaware settled over the asphalt like a thick, wet blanket. But inside our new office in Christiana, the central air conditioning hummed a steady, freezing rhythm. The space smelled of fresh drywall paint and the sharp tang of new commercial carpeting. We had outgrown the cramped brick room in Trolley Square by June of our second year. I signed a commercial lease for a wide, open floor plan with massive glass windows that looked out over a sprawling corporate park. I sat behind a real desk, resting my hands flat on a thick stack of printed paper. It was a finalized service agreement with a mid-sized regional grocery chain. The ink on the signature line was barely dry. That single document represented 120 refrigerated trucks running complex delivery routes across 5 different states. It meant I needed to hire 5 more software engineers and operations specialists by the end of the month. Most importantly, that stack of paper represented $4.2 million in projected revenue for Callaway Systems in our second year of business. I ran my thumb over the crisp edge of the contract. We did not win this account because we were a charming local startup. We won this account because we engaged in a direct, ruthless bidding war against Ashford Logistics Group, and we completely outmaneuvered them. The grocery chain executives had sat in our new conference room 2 weeks prior, looking exhausted by the endless delays and fuel overages they were suffering under Cordelia Ashford's legacy systems. I stood at the head of the table and ran a live simulation of their exact delivery network using my routing architecture. I showed them how to reduce their transit times by 30% while cutting their operational costs by 18%. Cordelia lost a major client for the very first time in a decade. She did not lose them to a massive corporate conglomerate. She lost them because her technology simply could not compete with the code I wrote at my kitchen table in the middle of the night. I looked out the glass walls of my office. 12 people were sitting at their workstations, typing lines of code, answering client calls, building the foundation of a company that was no longer just an idea. I took $4.2 million directly out of my mother-in-law's ledger, and for the first time since she poured me that half glass of wine at Christmas, I felt the heavy weight in my chest begin to lift. The victory celebration lasted exactly 2 months. On a Tuesday afternoon in late August, a professional courier walked through our glass double doors. He wore a crisp gray uniform and carried a digital clipboard. He bypassed the reception desk entirely, scanning the room until he made eye contact with me through the glass walls of my office. He walked straight to my open door and handed me a thick, stiff white envelope. I signed the digital screen with my index finger. The courier nodded once and walked out, leaving the heavy envelope resting on my desk. The paper was expensive linen stock. The logo stamped in the top left corner was embossed in dark navy ink. Fenton and Weir. They were the premier corporate litigation firm in Wilmington, and they served as the primary external counsel for Ashford Logistics Group. My heart hammered against my ribs. A fast, hollow rhythm that made my hands go cold. I closed my office door, pulling the blinds shut so the engineering team could not see my face. I slid a letter opener through the thick paper and pulled out a 2-page document. It was a formal cease and desist demand. The legal language was dense, aggressive, and designed to intimidate. The letter stated that Ashford Logistics Group hereby demanded that Callaway Systems immediately cease all use of proprietary trade secrets and intellectual property derived from their patented supply chain optimization technology. The document threatened immediate federal litigation and catastrophic financial damages if I did not comply within 72 hours. I picked up my phone with a trembling hand and dialed Nadia Park in Philadelphia. "They sent a cease and desist letter," I said the moment she answered. I kept my voice perfectly flat, trying to anchor myself against the rising panic. "Read me the key paragraph," Nadia instructed. Her tone was completely calm, the sound of a professional standing on familiar ground. I read the demand aloud, my eyes tracing the threatening words over and over. I waited for her to tell me that we were in terrible trouble, that the $400 million giant was finally coming to crush us. Instead, a soft, genuine laugh came through the phone speaker. "Ren, this is actually incredibly good news," my lawyer said. "Cordelia Ashford just made a massive strategic error." I stared at the thick paper on my desk. How is a threat of federal litigation a good thing? Because if she truly believed her company owned your work, she would not send a warning letter, Nadia explained, her voice quickening with absolute certainty. If she honestly thought your platform was created on her company time, using her corporate resources, she would simply file an infringement lawsuit and ask a judge for an injunction to shut you down today. A cease and desist letter is a bluff. It means her corporate counsel knows her underlying claim is fundamentally weak. They are trying to scare you into compliance because they do not actually want to go to court and open up their own patent application to federal scrutiny. I leaned back in my chair, letting the breath escape my lungs in a long, shaky sigh. The fact that they sent this letter is an admission that your technology is distinct enough to warrant a warning rather than a strike? Nadia continued, "We are going to respond, and we are going to make it devastating." By 5 o'clock that evening, Nadia emailed me a 3-page response. It was a masterpiece of legal aggression wrapped in professional courtesy. The core argument stated clearly that my algorithmic architecture was independently developed entirely outside of my previous employment hours, utilizing personal equipment and public data sets. Nadia explicitly noted that our development history was documented by secure server timestamps, predating the Ashford Logistics patent filing by 14 full months. The final sentence welcomed the opportunity to discuss the matter in a more formal federal setting. I printed the letter, signed my name with a steady hand, and sent it back to Fenton and Weir via certified overnight mail. That night, I lay awake in my dark apartment, staring up at the shadows dancing across the ceiling. The arrival of the legal threat confirmed the darkest suspicion I had carried for 2 years. Cordelia Ashford knew the software was mine. She knew it on the night of the Christmas dinner. The arrogant comments about pixie dust, the condescending smile, the swift termination by human resources a few weeks later, none of it was an accident. It was a calculated, choreographed performance designed to make me feel small, incompetent, and utterly defeated. She wanted me to walk away quietly so she could harvest my mind without paying the price. But she failed. I did not walk away. The power dynamic was finally shifting. I was no longer a terrified employee begging for a seat at the table. I was a legitimate threat. And the queen of the Delaware freight industry had just blinked. Following Nadia's aggressive response, Cordelia went completely silent. September bled into October, and the leaves across the Brandywine Valley turned brilliant shades of copper and gold. No federal lawsuit materialized. No further legal demands arrived at our office. The silence from the Ashford camp was absolute. and it was terrifying. Silence from a woman like Cordelia never meant self-surrender. It usually meant she was quietly loading a much larger weapon. Marshall continued to visit my apartment twice a week. The weather turned bitter and cold, so he began cooking heavy stews and roasting whole chickens in my small oven. We maintained our delicate, unspoken agreement to avoid discussing his family. But as the autumn weeks ticked by, I started to notice a subtle shift in his conversation. He stood at the stove one evening in November, stirring a pot of simmering broth, his shoulders tight beneath his gray sweater. "How many employees do you have over at the new office now?" Marshall asked, keeping his eyes focused on the wooden spoon moving through the liquid. 12, I replied, watching him carefully from the kitchen island. He nodded slowly. "Who handles your information technology security? Are you keeping your server backups entirely off-site?" I frowned, tracing the rim of my water glass. "Valerie manages our internal network. Everything is encrypted and mirrored to a secure facility in Virginia." "Why are you asking?" "Just curious," he murmured, pulling the spoon out and resting it on a ceramic plate. "You have to be careful as you grow. Corporate espionage is real in this industry. People look for vulnerabilities. At the time, I assumed he was simply expressing a husband's natural worry for my growing business. He knew how vicious the logistics world could be. It took me a very long time to understand the truth behind those specific, probing questions. Marshall was not making small talk. He was conducting his own quiet due diligence. He was making absolutely sure that my company was technologically secure and legally fortified before he dared to hand me the ammunition I needed. By the end of December, our second year came to a close. Callaway Systems successfully hit the projected $4.2 million in annual revenue. Major venture capital firms from New York and Boston were leaving voicemails on my office line, asking to schedule preliminary meetings for a Series B funding round. The week before Christmas, a heavy snowstorm blanketed Wilmington, turning the gray city into a blinding landscape of white. I bundled up in a thick wool coat and drove my sedan carefully down the salted roads to the local post office. I maintained a private postal box for sensitive corporate documents, preferring to keep essential legal mail away from the busy front desk of our Christiana office. I walked into the heated lobby of the post office, my boots leaving wet tracks across the linoleum floor. I turned the small brass key and pulled the metal door open. A single brown padded envelope sat inside the narrow metal box. There was no return address printed in the top left corner. The mailing label was written entirely by hand in sharp, aggressive block letters. It was a style of handwriting I did not recognize. I carried the package out to my car. I started the engine, turned the heater up to its maximum setting, and locked the doors. The freezing wind howled against the windshield, rattling the glass. I slid my car keys through the heavy tape, sealing the envelope, and pulled out a single, folded piece of paper. It was a black and white photocopy of an internal corporate email. The header indicated the message had been sent from the Ashford Logistics Group secure internal server. The date stamped at the top was from 2 years ago, sent just weeks after I had been fired. I looked at the subject line, Intellectual Property Integration regarding Project Centurion. I read the text of the message. It was a directive from a senior engineering manager instructing the development team to begin migrating a newly acquired routing algorithm into the main dispatch mainframe. The technical specifications listed in the email perfectly described my proprietary logic pathways. I stared at the wrinkled paper, the hot air from the dashboard vents blowing across my freezing hands. Someone inside Cordelia's fortress had access to her most sensitive internal communications. Someone with high-level security clearance had walked to a copier, duplicated a damning piece of evidence, placed it in a brown envelope, and mailed it directly to my private box. I folded the paper and slipped it into the inside pocket of my winter coat. I did not immediately call Nadia Park. I did not know if this document was a genuine offering from a hidden ally or a carefully constructed trap designed by Fenton and Weir to lure me into a fatal legal mistake. I put the car in gear and drove slowly through the falling snow. The Cold War was escalating, and an invisible informant had just handed me the very first piece of the puzzle. The 40th floor of the glass tower in Midtown Manhattan was quiet, insulated from the chaotic traffic crawling along the gray streets far below. The air smelled of expensive, polished walnut and cold central cooling. I sat at a massive boardroom table and signed my name on the final line of the term sheet. Meridian Ventures was officially leading our Series B funding round. They were injecting $120 million of capital directly into Callaway Systems. The pre-money valuation of the company I started at my kitchen table now sat at exactly $800 million. We were projecting $28 million in revenue for our third year of operation. We had 85 full-time employees working out of our Christiana office. Just that morning, the business magazine Forbes had published an issue naming me to their 30 under 40 list in the logistics sector. I hated that specific title. I was approaching 40, and I had spent my entire life feeling like I was constantly running out of time, constantly trying to catch up to people who had been handed a massive head start. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, resting my forehead against the cool glass. I pulled my phone from my blazer pocket and dialed Nadia Park. "Congratulations," my attorney said, the moment she answered. Her voice was crisp and sharp over the line. "You can finally afford to fight." I ended the call and dialed Bob Trammell. My very first angel investor picked up on the second ring. His initial $250,000 seed check was now worth $18 million on paper. "I told you it was not pixie dust." Bob chuckled through the speaker, his Tennessee drawl thick with satisfaction. I actually laughed out loud at the comment. It was the very first time I could laugh at the memory of Cordelia Ashford sitting at the head of her dining table, dismissing my life work as a fairy tale. But as I stood in that high-rise overlooking the city skyline, a cold, hollow realization settled deep in my chest. This was a false victory. I was winning the business game. I was building a massive company and actively bleeding clients away from Ashford Logistics Group in the free market. But the actual war had not even started. Cordelia still held the federal legal rights to my mind, and I was still the scholarship kid, waiting for someone to validate my existence. Bob Trammell introduced me to Theo Voss. Theo was a forensic intellectual property consultant who had spent years working as an examiner at the United States Patent and Trademark Office. We met at a small, independent coffee shop in downtown Wilmington on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in March. Theo was 52 years old. He wore a faded green flannel shirt and carried a battered leather briefcase that looked like it had survived multiple decades of abuse. He did not look like a high-powered corporate lawyer. He looked like a weary mechanic who happened to know how to read complex federal regulatory filings. He sat across from me at a wobbly wooden table, ignoring the strong smell of burnt espresso filling the humid air. He unlatched his briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder, laying it flat on the scratched surface. "I pulled the entire patent history for Ashford Logistics Group," Theo said. His voice was a low, methodical rumble. "I went back 20 full years. They have 17 different filings." I wrapped both hands tightly around my warm ceramic mug. "And what did you find?" "3 of those filings possess the exact same anomaly as yours," the consultant replied. He slid 3 separate pieces of paper across the table toward me. They were filed by the corporation, and the listed inventor was simply documented as Internal Research and Development Team. There were absolutely no individual names attached to the creations. All 3 applications covered completely different technology domains. One was for fleet telematics, one for warehouse automation, and one for predictive maintenance. I stared at the 3 printed sheets. The rain beat a steady rhythm against the cafe window. What does that mean, Theo? It means that in 20 years of corporate history, Cordelia Ashford has never once named a single individual inventor on a patent application. Theo explained, leaning closer. That is not standard industry practice. That is deliberate obfuscation. And when I cross-referenced those specific filing dates with Human Resources departure records, I found a very distinct timeline. He tapped the 3 pieces of paper with a blunt fingernail. 3 different people built revolutionary systems for her firm. 3 people were terminated within 6 months before the patent applications were officially filed. 3 patents were granted exclusively to the company. You are not an isolated incident, Ren. You are simply the 4th victim. The ambient noise of the coffee shop completely faded away. The hissing espresso machine, the chatter of the college students at the next table, the rain hitting the glass, all vanished. I looked down at those 3 pieces of paper. I did not recognize any of the names. They had all been fired long before I ever walked through the doors of Ashford Logistics. But the pattern was undeniable. Cordelia Ashford did not just steal intellectual property when an opportunity presented itself. She had built a sophisticated, systemic machine designed to identify brilliant people, harvest their life work, patent it under the corporate banner, and then immediately terminate their employment. She paid them a standard severance, forced them to sign a restrictive non-disclosure agreement, and bought their permanent silence. My breathing grew shallow, and a new kind of heat flared in the back of my neck. The objective of my upcoming lawsuit fundamentally changed right there at that wobbly table. I no longer just wanted to take my own algorithm back. I wanted to break her entire corrupt system. The following month, I drove my sedan to Newark, Delaware. I parked on a quiet, decaying suburban street and stared through my windshield at a small, single-story house. The front lawn was overgrown with thick weeds. A rusty screen door hung slightly off its hinges, groaning softly whenever the spring breeze hit it. An old Buick sat parked in an open garage, covered in a thick layer of undisturbed dust. I walked up the cracked concrete path and knocked firmly on the peeling wooden door. A man opened the door a moment later. Eldon Price was 68 years old. He was tall but incredibly thin, wearing a wrinkled blue polo shirt, faded khaki pants, and worn brown house slippers. His thinning hair was uncombed, and his pale eyes carried the heavy, exhausted look of a man who had spent a decade carrying a secret he could not share. "Miss Calloway," Eldon said. His voice was a thin, worn version of the classic Delaware accent, stretching the vowels just a little too long. "Theo told me you would be coming. Please come inside. I have coffee ready." I followed him into a small kitchen. It was spotlessly clean. The yellow Formica countertops were wiped down, and 2 white ceramic mugs sat perfectly aligned next to a dripping machine. A photograph of a young girl in a graduation gown was pinned to the refrigerator with a plastic magnetic clip. He lived with the careful, deliberate precision of a man who had lost far too much and was desperately holding on to whatever small order he had left. We sat at the small kitchen table. Eldon wrapped his trembling hands around his mug, letting the heat seep into his pale skin. He told me his story. 12 years ago, he was a senior engineer working for Ashford Logistics. He developed an early fleet telematics system designed to track vehicle location, monitor fuel consumption, and accurately predict maintenance failures for the entire trucking fleet. He built the core architecture on his own time, starting the project long before Cordelia ever hired him. She called it company innovation, Eldon said, his voice perfectly flat. He had clearly rehearsed this speech in his head 1,000 times, but this was the very first time he was saying it aloud to a stranger. I called it my life work. When he discovered the firm was quietly patenting his system, he walked right into Cordelia's massive executive office to protest. She told him he built it on her time, inside her building, using her data. She told him if he wanted to make things difficult, her corporate lawyers would make his life very uncomfortable. "Do you still have any original documentation?" I asked gently. "Emails? Early drafts? Anything predating your employment at Ashford?" Eldon stared down into his black coffee. "I burned almost all of it. I was so angry I could not look at the papers. But I kept one single thing." He stood up slowly, his knees popping in the quiet room. He walked over to the kitchen counter, pulled open a drawer, and reached underneath a folded dish towel. He brought back a thick, hardcover notebook. The spine was heavily worn, the corners frayed and soft from years of handling. Every circuit diagram, every algorithm, every single test result is in here. Eldon whispered. "Fully dated. Written in my own handwriting. Mr. Price, this could be the definitive evidence we need to prove." "I know exactly what it is," he interrupted, placing the heavy book on the table between us. His hands were shaking visibly now, not from his age, but from the sheer force of a memory held back for 12 painful years. "I have known what it is for over a decade. I was just waiting for someone who could actually use it." I looked at the frayed notebook resting on the yellow formica. The silence in the kitchen felt incredibly heavy. "Why did you not fight her?" I asked softly. Eldon looked straight into my eyes. "Because she had $400 million and a team of ruthless lawyers. I had a sick wife, a daughter entering college, and a mortgage I could barely afford. I signed the non-disclosure agreement. I took the $150,000 severance package. I bought my wife a little more time." He pushed the notebook across the counter toward me. "You do not have those excuses," the old engineer said. His eyes were completely dry, hardened by years of quiet regret. "So do not make mine." I picked up the notebook. It felt much heavier than a stack of paper should feel. I was holding 12 years of forced silence. I realized then that if I chose not to file the massive lawsuit, Cordelia would just keep doing this. There would be a 5th victim, a 6th, a 7th. They would all sit at kitchen tables exactly like this one, hiding their brilliance underneath dish towels because they could not afford to fight a giant. I walked out of the small house in Newark and sat in the driver's seat of my car. I stared at the steering wheel for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called Nadia. "We are not just filing a petition for patent inventorship correction," I told my attorney, my voice hard and entirely steady. "We are filing for trade secret misappropriation. We are filing for breach of fiduciary duty. We are filing for unjust enrichment. We are going to establish a clear pattern of criminal conduct covering 4 different victims, including myself." Nadia remained silent for 5 full seconds. I could hear the faint sound of Philadelphia traffic through the speaker. "I was hoping you would finally say that," she replied. Theo Voss tracked down the other 2 names on that list. Rachel Gomez is living in Arizona. Patrick Shea is down in Florida. Both of them are completely willing to talk. "Good," I said, turning the ignition key. "And Nadia, I want Theo to start digging deep into the Ashford Logistics financial books. If Cordelia Ashford did this to innocent people, she definitely did it to the money too." I officially filed the paperwork. I did not get to see the look on my mother-in-law's face when the reality of her situation finally breached the walls of her executive floor. But I knew exactly what happened. I knew Greer walked into that massive mahogany office carrying a legal discovery request from Park & Associates. I knew she laid the court order squarely on her mother's pristine desk. The federal judge was officially compelling Ashford Logistics Group to produce the original patent filing documents, the complete employment records for me, and the unredacted human resources files for Eldon Price, Rachel Gomez, and Patrick Shea. Cordelia would have read those names. She would have realized instantly that her ironclad non-disclosure agreements were entirely useless against a federal claim of criminal trade secret theft. She would have stood by her massive window, looking out over the Wilmington port, realizing for the first time in 30 years that the empire she built on the backs of others was beginning to fracture. I knew all of this because I saw the immediate, chaotic reaction. Cordelia did not respond with calculated strategy. She responded with pure, unadulterated panic. Within 72 hours of receiving our discovery request, Morris Fenton and his entire team of corporate litigators filed an aggressive 47-page formal objection with the court. They fought desperately to seal every single document we requested. They claimed executive privilege, trade secret protection, and undue burden. It was the sloppy, frantic work of a legal team scrambling to protect a terrified client. And I knew they had hired a crisis public relations firm because industry blogs suddenly started running vague, unsourced stories about the dangers of disgruntled former employees stealing corporate data. Cordelia was trying to control the narrative before the truth could escape the building. She was also desperately searching for the mole. The anonymous packages I had received, the internal emails detailing Project Centurion, the knowledge of the 3 prior victims. She knew someone inside her own fortress was handing me the keys to the gates. For the first time since I walked out of that dining room on Christmas Eve, I was no longer the one running. Cordelia Ashford was bleeding, and the water was full of sharks. I sat down at my desk at exactly 8:47 on a Monday morning in July. The Christiana office was quiet. The only sound, the soft clatter of keyboards from the engineering floor outside my glass walls. I placed my black coffee from the local cafe on the left side of my laptop, a deeply ingrained habit, and tapped the spacebar to wake the screen. An email notification immediately dropped down from the top right corner. The sender was Morris Fenton. Acting on behalf of Ashford Logistics Group, attached was a formal motion for a temporary restraining order, filed in the United States District Court for the District of Delaware. I opened the document, my eyes tracking the dense legal formatting. Cordelia Ashford was claiming that Callaway Systems was utilizing stolen trade secrets and causing her firm irreparable harm in the open market. She was explicitly asking a federal judge to order my company to immediately freeze all operations, halt all sales, and suspend any further software development until the broader lawsuit was entirely resolved. If a federal judge granted that order, my $800 million company would effectively die on paper before the sun went down. The domino effect took exactly 48 hours to demolish the safety I thought I had built. The lead partner from Meridian Ventures called my cell phone before noon on Tuesday. He used the careful, measured tone of a man protecting a massive investment, stating that their board needed to fully understand our legal exposure before they committed to any further funding rounds. 2 of our largest active clients called my sales director by Wednesday morning, asking very specific questions about data security. They did not cancel their contracts right then, but they made it perfectly clear they were monitoring the situation. Then, a major technology news outlet published an article with a completely misleading headline. It declared that Callaway Systems was facing severe intellectual property theft allegations from a former employer. I was the plaintiff in the actual inventorship claim. But Cordelia had weaponized the restraining order motion to make the media frame me as the criminal. By Thursday afternoon, 3 of my most senior software engineers quietly asked my human resources manager if they should start looking for other jobs. I closed my office blinds, picked up my phone, and called my attorney. My fingers squeezed the warm cardboard coffee cup so tightly the rim began to buckle and split. "Can they actually get this order granted?" I asked Nadia. My voice was tightly controlled, but the tremor was there, vibrating just beneath the words. "It is highly unlikely," Nadia replied, her tone a steady anchor in the rising storm. "Your current platform is demonstrably different from the prototype she patented. You have a new architecture, new features, and a registered provisional patent. But Ren, you need to understand something right now. Even if her motion completely fails in court, The damage is being done at this exact second. Investors read headlines, not federal court filings. So she does not even need to win the motion, I murmured, staring at the split coffee cup leaking dark fluid onto my desk. She just needs to bleed my resources dry. That is exactly her strategy, Nadia said. Litigation is not a search for truth to Cordelia. It is a weapon of attrition. She has done this before. Just ask Eldon Price. I stayed in the office until 11 o'clock that night, watching the headlights of passing cars sweep across the dark corporate park. The silence was suffocating. I drove to the local post office on my way home, unlocking my private metal box out of pure, desperate habit. There was a second anonymous package waiting inside. This envelope was larger and heavier than the first one. I sat in my parked car under the flickering orange glow of a street lamp and tore the thick paper open. Inside was a certified, fully authenticated copy of the Ashford Logistics Internal Intellectual Property Committee meeting minutes. The date stamped on the document was from December of my first year, right around the time of that terrible Christmas dinner. I read the third paragraph, and the air caught in my throat. The minutes explicitly stated that the routing algorithm was submitted by Wren Calloway during an internal demonstration. The document recorded a formal motion by Cordelia Ashford to classify the software as company property. The motion was approved 3-0. I traced my own printed name with my index finger. They had written my name down in their official corporate minutes. They openly acknowledged I built it, and then they deliberately erased my name when they filed the federal patent application. I drove back to my apartment and walked into my living room without turning on the lights. I looked at the small wooden bookshelf against the far wall. The picture frame Marshall had given me on the day I was fired sat exactly where I had placed it 3 years ago. "Keep this. You were here." That was what he had said in the freezing parking lot. I stared at the photograph of us, smiling in front of the Ashford building. If Cordelia had sent this new document as a trap, it was a brilliant one. But if someone inside the executive suite had sent it, I had a highly placed informant. I just did not know if I was ready to find out who it was. I picked up my phone and called Nadia. I told her about the certified minutes. "That is absolute gold," Nadia said, her voice sharp with adrenaline. "Who sent it?" "I do not know," I answered, sinking onto the edge of my sofa in the dark. And that is the problem. If Cordelia sent it, this is a trap to prove I possess stolen internal corporate documents. If someone else sent it, we have a mole. Both options are incredibly dangerous. Or both options are a weapon, Nadia countered smoothly. It simply depends on how we choose to swing the blade. Time compressed into a frantic blur of legal preparation, culminating in a suffocating August morning inside the J. Caleb Boggs Federal Building in downtown Wilmington. The courtroom was surprisingly small, smelling of heavy lemon polish and damp wool suits. There was no jury box, just a high wooden bench for the judge, 2 heavy tables for opposing counsel, and a few rows of wooden gallery seating behind us. I sat next to Nadia at the plaintiff table. Cordelia sat directly across the center aisle, flanked by Morris Fenton. She wore a pristine navy suit, a gold brooch pinned to her lapel, and the overwhelming scent of Joy by Dior drifted across the room, instantly transporting me back to that dining room table. She did not look at me. She kept her chin raised, her eyes fixed entirely on the empty judge chair. I looked at the gallery behind her. Greer was sitting in the second row, but the seat next to Cordelia was completely empty. Marshall was not there. I noticed the empty chair. Nadia noticed the empty chair. And Cordelia noticed it too. I watched my mother-in-law briefly turn her head, her eyes landing on the vacant space where her only son should have been sitting to support her empire. A tiny, almost imperceptible muscle twitched in her jaw before she snapped her gaze back to the front of the room. The hearing lasted for 3 grueling hours. Morris Fenton stood at the podium, his voice echoing off the wood panels as he argued that Ashford Logistics owned the intellectual property, that I developed the algorithm within the framework of my employment, and that Callaway Systems was causing his client massive, irreparable financial harm every single day we operated. Then Nadia stood up. She did not raise her voice. She did not use theatrical gestures. She simply laid out a mountain of irrefutable paper. She presented the secure timestamps from my personal laptop. She read the exact limiting language of my employment agreement. She produced the provisional patent filing for my new architecture. And then, she submitted the bombshell certified meeting minutes that explicitly named me as the submitter of the original code. Judge Patricia Halford leaned forward, looking over her reading glasses at the defense table. "Mr. Fenton," the judge said, her voice cutting through the quiet room like a knife. "If Miss Callaway developed this software outside of her normal working hours, on her own personal equipment, utilizing public data sets, and your own internal committee minutes specifically name her as the original submitter, on what legal basis are you claiming this was a work for hire?" Morris Fenton gripped the edges of the podium. "Your Honor, the overarching concepts were developed within an intellectual environment created entirely by Ashford Logistics. An environment is not a legal basis for federal patent inventorship." "Counselor," the judge replied dryly, the motion for a temporary restraining order was formally denied. We won the hearing. I walked out of that courthouse with my company intact. But my relief lasted exactly 40 minutes. Cordelia had fully prepared for a courtroom loss. The restraining order was merely her first frontal assault. By the time I walked back into my Christiana office, her secondary attack was already destroying my perimeter. The Ashford public relations firm released a massive press statement announcing an ongoing internal investigation into a former employee regarding unauthorized data access. They never explicitly named me, but in the tight circle of the logistics industry, every single person knew exactly who they meant. Greer Ashford simultaneously began calling the 3 largest clients currently under contract with Callaway Systems. She did not say anything overtly defamatory. She simply expressed deep professional concern about the ongoing federal litigation and the potential risks to their sensitive supply chain data. It was professional sabotage executed flawlessly. It was not enough to sue her for slander, but it was more than enough to plant seeds of terrifying doubt in the minds of corporate executives. The final blow landed the next morning. The board of directors at Meridian Ventures held a rapid vote to officially delay our Series C funding round until the legal situation was completely resolved. We instantly lost access to $200 million of potential capital. I sat alone in my office long after the engineering team had gone home. The room was pitch black, illuminated only by the cold blue glow of my laptop screen. I looked at an email from Meridian Ventures, explaining their prudent decision to pause the funding. We had exactly 14 months of financial runway left before the company went bankrupt. I looked down at my hands resting on the keyboard. A faint stain of blue ink lingered on my index finger from a whiteboard marker. I remembered standing in a cramped kitchen in Scranton, watching my grandmother quietly pack boxes after a landlord arbitrarily raised our rent. She never cried. She never complained about the fundamental unfairness of the world. She just told me to find a different rent, but I could not find a different company. This was my only battleground, and I was running completely out of ammunition. I drove home in a state of numb exhaustion. I stopped at the post office, my boots dragging across the floor. I opened my box and pulled out a third padded envelope. I sat in my car and tore it open. Inside was a meticulously detailed spreadsheet. It contained the exact dates of termination and the precise severance amounts paid to Eldon Price, Rachel Gomez, Patrick Shea, and myself. Next to those figures was a column calculating the total gross revenue Ashford Logistics had generated from the 4 stolen patents over 20 years. The total number was $347 million. At the very bottom of the page, written in blue ink, was a short note. "She cannot afford to lose this. Neither can you." I stared at the handwriting for a very long time. I knew the way the letter curled at the top. I knew the specific slant of the letter T. I had seen that exact handwriting on grocery lists stuck to my refrigerator, on birthday cards left on my pillow, and on sticky notes pressed against the bathroom mirror. It was Marshall. I traced the ink with a trembling finger. I felt a sudden, violent wave of paranoia wash over me. If my husband was the informant, he had been lying to my face for years. He possessed this information the entire time I was begging for angel investments, the entire time I was crying in my car after being fired. I thought I knew who he was, but I realized I was fighting a war entirely surrounded by ghosts. The board of directors demanded an emergency meeting in our Christiana conference room the very next week. September rain lashed against the large glass windows. Bob Trammell flew up from Memphis, taking a seat at the end of the long table. 2 representatives from Meridian Ventures sat opposite me, their faces pulled tight with corporate anxiety. Nadia attended via a secure video link on the wall monitor. "We deeply believe in the core technology you have built, Ren," the lead Meridian representative said, adjusting his expensive watch. "But this escalating litigation creates a massive zone of uncertainty. We have a fiduciary duty to our partners. We need to consider a settlement to stop the bleeding. The litigation only exists because the technology actually works," I replied, my voice echoing off the glass walls. I leaned forward, planting my hands flat on the table. "Cordelia Ashford is not suing me because I stole something from her. She is suing me because I am significantly better than the thing she stole. If we settle, we validate her theft." The room fell into a heavy, uncomfortable silence. Bob Trammell picked up a silver pen and tapped it rhythmically against the table. "I have watched Cordelia Ashford operate in this industry for 30 years, the old executive said, looking directly at the Meridian representatives. "She does not win by merit. She wins by sheer exhaustion. She bleeds you until you give up. If you force Ren to fold her cards right now, Cordelia does not just get to keep the stolen patent. She gets to keep doing this to the exact next person who walks through her doors." Bob called for a formal vote to continue the litigation. 4 hands went up in the room. The lead representative from Meridian abstained, staring out at the rain. We won the vote 4-1. The lawsuit would continue, but the victory felt like ash in my mouth. We still only had 14 months of runway. Cordelia's public relations campaign was actively choking our sales pipeline, and the massive revenue figures sitting in my coat pocket meant absolutely nothing if my company died before we ever reached a trial. After the meeting adjourned, I walked into the empty restroom and locked the door. I gripped the edges of the porcelain sink and stared at my reflection in the wide mirror. I saw the thick black glasses, the dark hair pulled back into a severe knot, the fading ink stain on my finger. No matter how many millions of dollars I generated, no matter how many brilliant algorithms I wrote, I was still just the desperate scholarship kid standing in the hallway, waiting for permission to exist. I closed my eyes, a crushing wave of exhaustion pressing down on my chest. How long did I have to keep proving I deserved to sit at the table? How many more battles did I have to win before the victory was actually enough? I realized, standing alone in that quiet, cold room, that I was surviving every single skirmish, but I was slowly bleeding to death from 1,000 tiny cuts. The late October night was heavy and silent. My apartment was completely dark, the only illumination coming from the amber glow of the street lamps filtering through the blinds. I lay flat on my back on the living room sofa, staring up at the shadowed ceiling. My laptop sat closed on the wooden coffee table. It was the very first time in 3 years I was not actively working past 10 o'clock at night. I thought about my grandmother. She died when I was 22 years old, right in the middle of my senior year at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. It happened incredibly fast. She was washing dishes at her kitchen sink, her hands submerged in warm, soapy water, and then her heart simply gave out. I flew back to Scranton the next morning. I remembered standing in her tiny, drafty kitchen, looking at the faded yellow linoleum floor. Her favorite ceramic coffee cup was still resting on the counter. The water inside the mug was not even cold yet. She never saw me graduate. She never knew I got married or that I built a technology company worth millions of dollars. Her final, enduring memory of me was a stubborn little girl with grease-stained hands fixing a broken dishwasher because we could not afford a repairman. I closed my burning eyes and asked the empty room what she would say to me right now. The answer did not come from a soft, comforting memory. It came from the cold, practical logic she had instilled in my very bones. She would look at my exhausted face and ask who I was fixing this machine for. She would ask if I was doing it for myself, or if I was doing it for them. I realized then that I had built Callaway Systems to prove Cordelia Ashford was wrong. I built it to prove my algorithm was not just pixie dust, to prove I was worthy of sitting at her immaculate dining table. But if Cordelia had never said those cruel words, if she had never fired me, would I still have built the platform? Yes. I wrote the foundational code at 2 a.m, long before that terrible Christmas dinner ever happened. The software existed because I desperately wanted it to exist. I did not need to prove myself to Cordelia. I did not need to prove myself to the wealthy venture capitalists in Manhattan. I only needed to prove myself to the woman who believed in me before I had any evidence to offer the world. And my grandmother was gone. That meant I finally had to believe in myself. Morning arrived with bright, crisp October sunlight slanting through the window blinds, casting long, pale stripes across the hardwood floor. I woke up on the sofa, my neck stiff and aching from sleeping at an awkward angle. I sat up slowly, rubbing my shoulders, and looked across the living room. My eyes settled on the bookshelf. The small wooden picture frame sat exactly where I had placed it. Marshall and I were smiling in front of the Ashford Logistics building. "Keep this," he had told me in the freezing parking lot. "You were here 3 years." That frame had sat on the shelf for 3 entire years. I looked at it every single day, but I never picked it up. I never opened the back of it because I was terrified. I was afraid it was just a simple photograph, an empty gesture from a weak man. I was equally afraid it was holding a secret that would force me to finally confront him. After my long night in the dark, I finally stood up. I walked over to the shelf, picked up the frame, and turned it over in my hands. Small, rigid metal clips held the thick cardboard backing firmly in place. I bent the clips back, one by one, the metal scraping softly against the wood. I pulled the cardboard away from the glass, taped neatly to the inside of the backing board. Hidden completely out of sight was a small, black, 32-gigabyte flash drive. My breath caught in my throat. I carried the tiny piece of plastic to the coffee table and plugged it directly into my laptop. A single digital folder appeared on my glowing screen. The title read, "For Ren, When You Are Ready." I clicked the folder open, and a treasure trove of absolute devastation spilled across my screen. First, I found the original federal patent application documents. The designated line for the named inventor clearly said, Ren Callaway, but a thick, red digital stroke was drawn straight through my name, the handwriting in the margins, crossing out my identity and replacing it with internal research and development team, belonged unmistakably to Cordelia Ashford. Second, I opened a chain of internal corporate memorandums between Cordelia and Morris Fenton. They explicitly discussed how to carefully reclassify my algorithm as company property without triggering a formal work-for-hire review from the legal department. Cordelia had actually written that my employment agreement would not hold up in court if I ever decided to look closely at the fine print. Third, I found the complete human resources records for Eldon Price, Rachel Gomez, and Patrick Shea. The files contained their exact termination dates, their specific severance amounts, and the scanned copies of their non-disclosure agreements. Every single one of them was fired exactly 1 to 3 months before their respective patents were officially filed with the federal government. Fourth, I clicked on the finalized corporate financial spreadsheets. The documents detailed the total gross revenue Ashford Logistics had generated from those 4 stolen patents over the last 2 decades, $347 million. It matched the anonymous package I received at the post office perfectly. Finally, I noticed a simple text document at the bottom of the folder. I opened it. "I should have said this at the dinner table," the text read. "I should have said it in the parking lot. I am saying it now because I could not do it then. I am sorry, Ren. Marshall." I picked up my phone and dialed my husband's number. "I found the flash drive," I said. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any anger or lingering sadness. A long, heavy silence stretched across the cellular connection. I could hear his shaky, uneven breathing through the speaker. "I put it in there the very day you were fired." 3 years ago, I replied, gripping the edge of the coffee table. "Yes," Marshall whispered. "You could have told me," I said, my knuckles turning white. "You could have walked into Nadia Park's office, put this drive on her desk, and ended this entire nightmare in year 1. I know." His voice broke, cracking under the crushing weight of his own guilt. "I was afraid. I was terrified of Mom. I was afraid of losing the company, and I was deeply afraid of losing you if I chose the wrong side. So I chose nothing, and I lost you anyway." I looked down at the small black drive protruding from my laptop. Marshall had hidden a nuclear weapon inside a parting gift. He had meticulously prepared this evidence in advance, which meant he knew his mother was committing a federal crime from the very beginning. But he chose the most indirect, cowardly method possible to help me. I was furious, but I also finally understood. Marshall was the ultimate product of Cordelia. She had raised a son to never, ever stand up to her authority. He did not naturally choose to be a coward. He was systematically trained to be one. "Marshall," I said, staring at the glowing screen, "I am filing the lawsuit this week. Every single document on this drive is going to the federal court. Are you prepared for what happens to your mother?" "She did this to herself," he answered, his voice hollow and defeated. "I just could not be the one to pull the trigger." "You did not have to be," I told him. "You just had to hand me the gun." I ended the call and immediately dialed Nadia. "I have absolutely everything," I told my lawyer, my heart pounding a steady, relentless rhythm against my ribs. "I have the original patent filing with Cordelia's handwritten redactions. I have the email chains planning the theft, the financial records, the witness list of 4, and I know the exact source of the anonymous packages." "Who?" Nadia asked. "My husband." Nadia went completely silent for 3 seconds. It was the longest pause I had ever heard from her in 3 years of litigation. "We file on Monday," Nadia ordered, her voice cold and absolute. "All claims. Federal court and chancery court. We go full scorched earth." Nadia and her legal team filed the massive complaint simultaneously on a gray November morning. In the United States District Court for the District of Delaware, they filed a petition for patent inventorship correction under Title 35, Section 256. The filing boldly declared that I was the true inventor and that the corporate patent was fraudulently attributed to an anonymous internal team. In the Delaware Chancery Court, They filed for breach of fiduciary duty, unjust enrichment regarding the $347 million in revenue, and massive trade secret misappropriation. They included sworn witness declarations from Eldon Price, Rachel Gomez, and Patrick Shea. They attached the key exhibit, the original patent document featuring the red ink deliberately crossing out my name. Cordelia Ashford received the formal service of process at exactly 17 minutes past 9 in the morning at her corporate headquarters. I learned later that Greer stood in the doorway of the executive office, watching her mother read the massive stack of legal complaints. For the very first time in Greer's entire life, she saw her mother have absolutely nothing to say. I was not at the courthouse when the clerk formally stamped the filings. I was sitting at my desk in the Christiana office. 85 employees were working outside my glass walls. The company I built was currently valued at $800 million, and the woman who called me pixie dust was finally cornered. I opened my laptop and clicked through my directories until I found my original development folder. Callaway Systems version 0.1. It was still there. I opened the very first file and looked at the timestamp on the first line of code, 11:47 at night. I remembered that freezing winter night in my old apartment. I remembered eating cheap, instant noodles at the kitchen table, the bottom of my laptop burning my thighs, and the electric feeling rushing through my blood. I had absolute certainty that the mathematics I was writing would change the way trucks moved across the country. I was not wrong. It had changed everything. The only thing about to change now was who finally received the credit. The air in Nadia Park's Philadelphia conference room tasted like stale coffee and nervous sweat. March rain lashed heavily against the 7th floor windows, blurring the city skyline into a gray smear. A professional videographer adjusted his camera tripod in the corner of the room, while a court reporter hovered her hands over her stenography machine, waiting for the deposition to begin. Nadia sat calmly on my left. Morris Fenton sat directly across the wide mahogany table. Cordelia Ashford sat between her team of corporate lawyers. She wore a pristine charcoal suit and her signature gold lapel brooch. The familiar scent of Joy by Dior drifted across the polished wood, but it smelled faint today, overpowered by the sharp tension in the room. I sat slightly behind my attorney. I did not speak a single word. I was there simply to watch, and I wanted Cordelia to feel the heavy weight of my eyes on her face. Nadia began her questioning with practiced, clinical precision. She established the founding history of the logistics firm. She asked about the 17 different technology patents filed over the last 20 years. Cordelia answered in a crisp, rehearsed voice, claiming repeatedly that innovation at her company was always a highly collaborative corporate effort and that no single person was ever responsible for a breakthrough. Nadia opened a plain manila folder. She slid Exhibit A across the wide table. It was the original federal patent application we had recovered from the flash drive. The thick red ink crossing out my printed name glared brightly under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Is this your handwriting, Miss Ashford?" Nadia asked quietly. Morris Fenton immediately objected, his voice rising in panic. Nadia ignored the lawyer completely, keeping her eyes locked on the witness. She reminded the room it was a simple document identification question. Cordelia stared at the piece of paper for 7 long seconds. The video camera recorded her absolute, frozen stillness. "I do not recall making that mark," Cordelia finally answered, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave. Nadia placed Exhibit B on the wood. It was the printed email chain directed to Morris Fenton regarding the urgent reclassification of my software. Nadia read the specific lines out loud for the court reporter. She read the exact sentence where Cordelia admitted my employment agreement would not hold up under legal scrutiny if I ever decided to fight back. More objections flew across the table from the defense team. Nadia simply moved forward without missing a beat. She laid down Eldon Price's worn, handwritten notebook. She presented Rachel Gomez's dated design files. She introduced Patrick Shea's technical deployment logs, 4 different employees, 4 unique patents, 4 swift terminations within 6 months of the federal filings. This is a systemic pattern of conduct, Nadia stated, leaning back in her chair. Cordelia maintained her rigid, defensive posture. But I was watching her hands resting on the table. Her right pinky finger began to twitch, scraping rhythmically against the edge of the mahogany wood. It was a tiny, entirely uncontrollable movement. The untouchable queen of the Delaware freight industry was losing her grip, and she did not even realize her own body was betraying her panic. Then Nadia asked the final, devastating question. She asked if Marshall Ashford possessed high-level executive access to the secure corporate patent files. Cordelia slowly lifted her head. For the very first time in 3 hours, she looked directly past the lawyers. She looked straight into my eyes. I watched a terrible, crushing realization wash over her pale features. She suddenly understood exactly who had mailed the internal corporate documents to my private post office box. She realized her own son had chosen to betray her empire to protect his wife. That singular realization broke something vital and permanent inside her chest. I declined to answer that question on the advice of my counsel, Cordelia whispered. Morris Fenton immediately called for a recess. 10 minutes later, I stood in the women's restroom, washing my hands in the sink. Nadia leaned against the cold, tiled wall, watching my reflection in the mirror. She told me Cordelia was absolutely going to offer a massive financial settlement because going to trial after that disastrous deposition would be corporate suicide. I turned off the running water and dried my hands on a paper towel. I do not want a quiet settlement. I want a public federal ruling. Nadia nodded once, a sharp smile appearing on her face. Then we go to trial. September brought a crisp, early autumn chill to Wilmington. The main courtroom inside the United States District Court was massive, smelling faintly of ancient oak benches and chemical floor wax. The public gallery was packed tight with industry observers, financial reporters, and curious venture capitalists. Bob Trammell sat in the front row right behind our table. Eldon Price occupied the wooden witness stand, wearing a dark, pressed suit for the very first time in 12 years. His grown daughter sat in the gallery, clutching her boyfriend's hand tightly. Across the center aisle, Cordelia sat next to Morris Fenton. Greer occupied a seat directly behind her mother, but the heavy wooden chair next to the defense table was completely empty. Marshall had not appeared at the courthouse. Cordelia kept her chin raised, absolutely refusing to look at the vacant seat beside her. Judge Patricia Halford adjusted her microphone and began to read her final judicial decision. The federal court officially found that Wren Calloway was the true and sole inventor of the routing algorithm. The judge cited the secure computer timestamps, the explicit limits of my employment contract, and the damning red ink deliberately obscuring my name on the original application. She went much further, formally noting a deliberate, willful pattern of systemic misappropriation by Ashford Logistics Group against multiple former employees over 2 decades. Nadia turned her head and looked at me. I did not smile. A profound, overwhelming sense of relief washed through my blood. Relaxing muscles I had kept tight for 5 years. It felt exactly like finally setting down a heavy stone. I glanced up at Eldon on the witness stand. He looked down at his daughter in the gallery and gave a tiny, almost invisible nod. The young woman covered her mouth and began to weep quietly. Eldon did not cry. He had shed all of his tears a decade ago in his quiet kitchen. He just sat up perfectly straight, his dignity permanently restored. 3 months later, the Delaware Chancery Court delivered the final crushing blow. They found Cordelia guilty of a severe breach of fiduciary duty and the criminal theft of corporate trade secrets. They ordered her firm to pay $187 million in unjust enrichment damages, accounting for the massive revenue generated by the stolen technology. The logistics firm simply did not possess that kind of liquid capital. Morris Fenton filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection the very next morning. The massive company Cordelia had built over 30 years was forced into a court-supervised auction. Callaway Systems was now valued at over $3 billion, following a wildly successful Series C funding round. We entered a formal, aggressive bid in the bankruptcy auction. We offered exactly $85 million to purchase the entire fleet of trucks, all existing client contracts, the physical headquarters building, and the brand name itself. Nobody else wanted to touch a firm drowning in a toxic intellectual property scandal. No one placed a higher bid. I bought the company that fired me using the money I earned from the very thing they tried to steal. Nadia called me on a Tuesday afternoon to confirm the federal auction was officially closed. I stood in my office, looking down at the Wilmington port, where the massive cargo ships were moving slowly through the gray water. "Schedule the television interview with Bloomberg," I told her. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the Ashford Logistics headquarters the following March. I was entering the building as the sole owner. The lobby floor gleamed with polished marble. A large bronze plaque on the wall still read Ashford Logistics Group. I stopped and stared at the metal letters. A team of contractors was scheduled to arrive that weekend to install the new signage. It would soon read Callaway Ashford Logistics. I refused to erase her legacy completely. I was simply adding mine to the front of it. I walked up the open staircase to the second-floor operations pit. 30 people were sitting at their workstations. Many faces were entirely new, but several veteran dispatchers recognized me immediately. A senior technician stood up from his chair. He cleared his throat and softly welcomed me back to the building. Several other employees stood up in complete silence. Nobody clapped or cheered. They just stood at their desks, offering a quiet, profound gesture of respect. It was more than enough. Greer stood at the far end of the long hallway. I had specifically chosen to keep her on staff because she was genuinely excellent at managing human resources, even though she had been the one forced to execute my termination years ago. Greer looked at me. I looked back at her. She offered a very small, tight nod. I returned the gesture, and we both went back to work. I walked into the massive executive corner office. The heavy oak desk faced the harbor windows. I sat down in the leather chair. It was adjusted for Cordelia's height, leaving my feet dangling slightly above the carpet. I reached under the seat and lowered the chair until my shoes rested firmly on the floor. A thick white envelope sat precisely in the center of the clean desk. Cordelia had left it there on her final day in the building. I opened the flap. Her father's heavy gold signet ring slid out, landing softly on the wood. A small piece of personal stationery accompanied the jewelry. The handwriting was sharp, aggressive, and perfectly precise. "You reminded me of someone I used to be," the note read. "That is why I could not stand you." I picked up the gold ring. The metal felt surprisingly warm in my palm. Cordelia was completely incapable of offering a genuine apology. She did not know how to form the words, but by leaving the ultimate symbol of her family legacy on my desk, she was finally acknowledging my existence. She was handing the keys of her kingdom to the very person she had tried so desperately to banish. I opened the top drawer of the desk, placed the ring and the note safely inside, and pushed it shut. 1 month later, 200 people gathered in the main auditorium on the ground floor of the newly rebranded headquarters. It was the official launch event for our fully integrated software platform. Bob Trammell sat in the front row, grinning broadly in a tailored suit. Nadia stood near the side exit, her eyes scanning the large crowd with sharp satisfaction. Eldon Price sat in the second row, holding his daughter's hand tightly. I walked up to the wooden podium. I did not wear a corporate blazer. I wore a simple button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up to my elbows, and my thick black reading glasses rested on my nose. I was presenting myself as an engineer, not a polished executive. 5 years ago, someone sitting at a dinner table called my work pixie dust, I said into the microphone. A low murmur rippled through the audience. The business reporters in the back row had already published endless articles about the trial, but hearing the origin story out loud carried a different kind of weight. She was not entirely wrong, I continued, looking directly at Eldon. Pixie dust makes things fly. It takes something very ordinary. A simple idea, a heavy truck, a struggling supply chain, and it gives it incredible lift. That is exactly what an algorithm does. It is not magic. It is just brutal, relentless work at 2 a.m. when nobody else is watching. I pressed a button on the podium, and the massive screen behind me illuminated the dark room. I announced the official launch of Project Pixie Dust. It was our next-generation logistics platform, seamlessly combining fleet management, warehouse automation, and predictive maintenance. We had successfully integrated all the stolen technologies, rebuilt them the right way, and attached them to the proper names. The credits rolled slowly across the bright screen. Core architecture built by Ren Callaway. Fleet Telematics Foundation built by Eldon Price. Warehouse Design built by Rachel Gomez. Predictive Engine built by Patrick Shea. Eldon stared up at his own name glowing in bright white letters. 12 years of hiding a frayed notebook under a kitchen towel were finally over. His daughter squeezed his hand, tears streaming down her face. The old engineer did not cry, but his mouth trembled as he sat up much taller in his chair. Rachel and Patrick were watching a live video feed from their respective homes across the country. The creators were finally receiving their public due. Hours later, the auditorium was completely empty. The catered food was cleared away, and the guests had all returned to their hotels. I stood alone in the dim lobby. The new backlit sign on the wall glowed softly, casting long shadows across the marble floor. The front glass doors slid open, and Marshall walked inside. It was the very first time he had stepped foot in the building since his mother lost control of the company. He wore a dark winter jacket, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked incredibly tired, the lines around his eyes etched deep into his skin from years of quiet stress. I watched the live broadcast on the internet, Marshall said, stopping a few feet away from me. You could have come in person, I replied softly. I did not know if I was actually welcome here. I looked at the man I had married. The fierce anger that had burned inside me for years had finally burned itself out, leaving only a quiet, objective clarity in its wake. You handed me the gun, Marshall, I told him. That absolutely counts for something. But you also let me fight completely alone in the dark for 3 years. That counts too. He nodded slowly, staring down at the polished marble. He had stopped apologizing months ago. We both knew the words could not change the past. What happens now, Ren? I am offering you a job, I said, my voice steady. I need a vice president of fleet operations. I am not offering it because your last name is Ashford. I am offering it because you are genuinely excellent at moving trucks. But if you take this position, you report directly to me. You do not report to your mother's ghost. Marshall looked around the quiet lobby. He looked at the walls his mother had built. And he looked at my name, glowing brightly on the corporate sign above us. I will think about it, he finally whispered. Do that, I said. He turned around and walked back out into the cool spring night. I watched the glass doors slide shut behind him. I honestly did not know if he would accept the offer. And for the very first time in my life, I realized I did not need to know. The outcome of his decision would no longer define my future. I walked upstairs to my new office. The room was dark, and completely silent. I walked over to the small wooden bar cabinet in the corner. Cordelia used to keep expensive scotch inside. I had thrown those bottles away and replaced them with a single bottle of Merlot, the exact same vintage she had poured at that Christmas dinner. I pulled a heavy crystal glass from the shelf and opened the bottle. I poured the dark red wine. I did not stop halfway. I poured the liquid until it reached the very brim. A full, generous serving that nearly spilled over the edge. I lifted the heavy glass. I did not offer a toast to my victory, and I did not toast to my defeated enemies. I just took a long, slow drink. The wine tasted of dark cherries and heavy tannins. It tasted like absolute freedom. I set the glass down on the edge of the oak desk. I opened my laptop, the screen illuminating the dark room with a soft blue light. I created a brand new folder on my desktop and typed the title, Callaway Ashford Systems, version 1.0. I could almost hear my grandmother's voice echoing in the quiet space, telling me that I had fixed the machine, and now it was time to build the next one. I smiled to myself, placed my hands on the keyboard, and started to code. Sometimes, the hardest battles you fight are against the people sitting right across your own dining room table. When someone tries to convince you that your hard work is nothing more than a silly hobby, or when they try to steal the credit for the life you built with your own two hands, it is incredibly easy to start doubting your own mind. But your worth is never determined by the people who refuse to see it. You do not have to scream to prove you belong in the room. You can stay completely quiet, gather your strength in the dark, and let the undeniable results of your work speak for you. Real power is not about making other people admit they were wrong. Real power is finally realizing that you never actually needed their permission to succeed in the first place. Have you ever had to walk away from an environment that constantly belittled you just to protect your peace and build your own future? How did you finally find the courage to stop waiting for their approval and start trusting yourself? Please share your story with me in the comments below, because I read every single one.